1% of the enchants hold 99% of the usage rate. That's just a joke, but honestly, it really isn't too far off. A vast majority of the enchants in game really don't get usage in PvP or PvE, and when the utility and the usage of enchants is already split between two groups, it makes the most dominant enchants in their respective categories even better than the submissive and irredeemable enchants sitting at the bottom with negative use rates. Anyway, before we get into it, I will be live on Wednesday, November 26th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, ranking your Deepwoken drips. So be sure to submit to the Google form down below, and remember, 1 build per person, 2 images max, or your submission may be deleted. Make sure to subscribe, and let's get straight into it. Alright, so first of all, let's separate enchants into 3 categories: PvP, PvP, and versatile, which means it can be used in either. From there, we can separate them into usable and unusable absolute garbage that nobody should ever run under any circumstance. I'm joking, that's hyperbole, you can run them if you want to. Starting with PvP. The PvP enchants are going to be enchants that are obviously pretty much only useful in PvP. This means anything that benefits the player by taking something from other players in an offensive manner, or providing you with offensive capability more than defensive capability. Now here I could separate the enchants into another like 3 categories based on how they're offensively used, whether it's a stat buff of some sort of utility like gluttony, or some sort of interaction changer like a crit overriding enchant, or a new mechanic like elasticity. Regardless, for simplicity's sake, the PvP enchants are going to be blazing, bluster, chilling, deferred, detonation, elastic, harrowing, metal, nemesis, nightbringer, which is ironic because it's literally only obtainable through PvE, obfuscation, solar, stone, storm, stormbreaker, umbral night, windswept, curse of the authoritative, curse of the bloodthirsty, curse of the repulsion, curse of the unbidden, curse of the void, and Curse of the Yun Shoal. If there's an enchant you think is for PvP that isn't in this list, it's because it's probably more versatile than you'd expect, and it probably has some sort of PvE capability. But this list right here is basically every PvP usable enchant that can generally only be used in PvP, and I guess you could make arguments like some enchants like Umbral Night or Windswept could potentially be used in PvE, but they really don't benefit you at all if used in those scenarios. Now, out of all of these enchants, the ones that get actual usage are as follows. Metal, because it aids in armor penetration. Detonation, because it's a straight DPS upgrade. Chilling and blazing, because they can both be used to counter ever-changing Aegis, but also chilling in particular is really good on its own, and they both provide a straight DPS buff. Funnily enough, blazing does synergize with the flame charm stat, however I'd recommend using either chilling or blazing and any other attunement because it provides an M1 counter for ever-changing Aegis, making your build more versatile. Then there's obfuscation, because chip damage is fun to cheese with, and an invisible weapon is a weird gimmick that kind of catches people off guard every once in a while. And I actually forgot, but Curse of the Void is a viable enchant because it is a very good ganking enchant, which both punishes people for, you know, dying in the overworld, while also making it harder for them to come back, and the anti-heal is just really good. Every other enchant in the previous list is either pretty much completely unused, take Curse of the Bloodthirsty for example, because, you know, it's just not good, it's completely outclassed. Like, look at Deferred, 7% damage buff in comparison to Bloodthirsty's 10%. And then there is no debuff, which causes self-damage on miss. As for Curse of the Bloodthirsty's secondary effect of draining more blood, this rarely plays into effect except for in super long-winded ganks, but in a gank where you're having like a 15v15 almost in a server, and it's like a war server, people are going to be running away to heal, and it's going to be pretty hard to stop them from running away. And even if they die, they're probably just going to spawn back in their guild base anyway, so it really doesn't matter. And the reason why Deferred isn't used that often, despite it having the highest damage modifier without a downside, is just because the utility things like Metal provide like better options. Metal, for example, provides more penetration and armor piercing, which would actually prove to be more effective in most scenarios in combat over the extra damage that you could get with Deferred. Which, by the way, Deferred is technically a versatility enchant right now because it's bugged and it does 2x damage in PvE, so if you want to bug abuse, just run Deferred on your PvE builds. But excluding that bug, it's really a PvP only enchant, so yeah. And some may argue that Nightbringer is a versatile enchant and can be used in PvP or PvE, but I disagree simply because it's vastly more useful in a PvP scenario, and also most people aren't really running shadow PvE builds because it's more so a PvP attunement, or at least one that centers around PvP more. Then we have the PvE only enchants. Astral. Yeah, actually, Astral is the only enchant in the entire game that is basically only usable in PvE. Its main upside is an increase in all PvE damage by 20% that bypasses both soft and hard damage multiplier caps. And its secondary upside is an AoE that deals 3% damage in PvP, which is negligible seeing as how it procs when you parry 3 times in a row, which in a PvP scenario isn't even worth doing because you could have spent that response time getting more damage via actually attacking. Or in PvE, the AoE does 100 damage, which means it actually is really good against enemies with multi-hits. And yes, it does activate on the crit, but that doesn't make it much better for PvP. You would get more damage running any other enchant that increases your damage than the 3% that you might get on the crit, because it's not guaranteed. Now, every enchant that I haven't named yet falls into the versatility category, as in it can be used in both PvP or PvE scenarios, although many are outclassed in both. The enchants which fall within the versatility category are Gluttony, Grim, Heroism, Stone, Providence Thorns, Wild, Seer, Vampirism, Curse of the No-Life King, Tears of the Edenkite, and the Curse of Isli's Ember. Now, out of all of these, which are viable and for what? Well, Grim is good for PvE mage builds, usually used on the Pale Briar or with the Quick Fang crit, and it's also got a decent PvP upside, providing more damage and posture damage for a few seconds on proc, but it remains outclassed in PvP while remaining a good option in PvE. Wild is also actually pretty good in PvE, specifically on the Pale Briar is what most people use it on because of the AoE spam and the Diluvian mechanism, and I guess it's decent crowd control and ganks during PvP, but in PvP it's kind of just outclassed by Tears of Edenkite. Now, speaking of Tears of Edenkite, it is most ideal for PvP, but does have PvE usage in the same way Wild does. The fact that it's not instant and just spawns those bubbles does, however, make it less of a popular option than Wild for specifically PvE, but in PvP it is actually very good crowd control. With that being said, it is preferred in PvP, as PvE just has more specified options. Now, Gluttony is technically usable in both PvP and PvE, as it sustains your food and water bars, but talents like Carnivore exist and make this redundant. And even if they didn't, why would food and water be your #1 concern to where you're going to choose this as your enchant over anything else that doesn't outright just kill you like Curse of the Bloodthirsty? That's like the worst enchant in the game, by the way. They really need to buff that thing. Then we have Heroism, which is better in PvP due to the status effect reflection, but does have its usage in PvE. The only problem is that it depends on you taking damage in PvE, and generally PvE players don't do a ton of that unless they're tanking, at which case there's just things that you could do to increase your DPS more than using this enchant. And also against bosses, where Chain of Perfection is ideal for speed, taking damage at the beginning of the fight just for your enchant effect just doesn't really make it worth it, because it's either take damage during the beginning of the fight and waste time doing that, or take damage during the middle of the fight and lose your Chain of Perfection. So yeah, and also the better you are at the game, the less value you get in both PvP and PvE from Heroism, which makes this enchant redundant and ironic because it just shouldn't exist. No, it has right to exist, it's just not good. Then we have Stone, which is good when used in a build that can easily stack up posture, such as on heavy weapon builds for PvP. It also is decently good against specifically humanoid bosses, which can be guard broken and posture stacked, making it good against the Maestro and Duke, for example, especially because Maestro is only vulnerable to non-instant guard breaks. However, it just isn't good enough in PvE against more scenarios to make it super worth using because it's not very versatile, and most people aren't going to farm Duke and Maestro for stuff with PvE builds, right? Then we have Providence Thorns, which is decent in both PvP for the fact that it allows you to keep up pressure while you're playing more defensively, and in PvE because it gives you free damage for parrying, which you're going to be doing anyway. This enchant is one of the best in PvE and has always been like top 3 PvE enchant. Generally in PvP it's not used too much, but it remains very good in PvE even after a multitude of nerfs that it's received over the years. Then there is Seer, which can bypass the penetration cap, making it usable for armor piercing both in PvP and PvE. However, people generally don't use it often because it's very M1 reliant, and right now mage builds kind of seem to be the more dominant in the PvP meta, and even if they weren't, this thing kind of just gets outclassed by the ease of use that is metal, which just destroys people's entire armor bar, and then that's just boom, instant 100% penetration. So yeah, metal kind of just destroys this thing. It is decent in PvE for the armor piercing though, so it can be used in a similar way to Grim, and a lot of builds that use Grim can switch to Seer, and it's pretty good with Quick Fang or Iron Tusk because they can proc it quickly. Then we have Vampirism, which is good in both PvP and PvE PvE for the exact same reason. It provides sustainability and lifesteal, what's not to love. It's also one of the most nerfed enchants in the entire game, if not the second most, probably behind Providence Thorns. And then there's the Curse of Isli's Ember, which is basically just a direct damage buff in both PvP and PvE long term, with the only downside of the curse being the fact that it provides temporary health to a target, which makes subsequent attacks less effective. This makes the enchant better on heavy weapons, but honestly it's not very good in PvP or PvE because it kind of punishes you for applying pressure, which, by the way, that's bad game design, devs. That's bad game design. You shouldn't punish someone for, you know, doing something right. And then finally there's the Curse of the No Life King, which is used for both PvP and PvE. Now, while it can work in very specific PvE builds, most don't run it nearly as much as they used to with the old maximum willpower PvE builds for hell mode that people would have. As for PvP, this enchant remains quite a popular choice in ganking and boss raiding builds, as it provides the most sustain in the game out of any enchant, and also it doesn't rely on you getting hits because it's literally just a passive regen buff, making it very good, which is also why like Silent Heart builds run this a lot now, and then they just overworld gank, or even depths gank, some people use it. Now, out of every enchant we've listed, the only enchants which are viable and for what goes as follows. In PvE, you have Astral, Grim, Wild, Providence Thorns, Vampirism, and Seer if you want to be a little bit more creative. As for PvP, you have Blazing, Chilling, Detonation, NLK, Elastic, Vampirism, Metal, Stone, Obfuscation, and the Tears of the Eden Kite. And if we're being real, Blazing and Chilling are basically the same enchant. This means that out of the 36 enchants, only 10 are really viable in PvP and commonly used, making that 27% or just over a quarter of all enchants. And in PvE, that is 6 out of 36, or about 16% of all the enchants in-game. Equally distributed, only 15 out of 36 of the total in-game enchants are viable, meaning that 41% of the game's enchants actually have viable usage. And I'm trying to be generous here because Stone is not nearly as used as some of the other enchants on this list, but I think it does have its own place. And of course, before a million people decide to comment, but I use this enchant and it's good, think. Use your brain. Are you the majority? No. Is that enchant a huge decider in why you win most chime matches or your overworld ganks? Probably not. And if you switched out your enchant with a better one, would your build be equal or stronger than it was before? More than likely. The point I'm trying to make here is that 60% of the game's enchants, or 59% if you want to be very specific, are left in a sorry state where the only people really using them are people who got stuck with them, or people who just realize that enchants don't matter a majority of the time, so they just kind of run whatever to have it, or you're trying to be different or bug abusing. So yeah, I mean, bug abusing is pretty common. Deferred is bugged and gives double damage in PvE right now, and every other enchant is just whatever. It's like build or playstyle specific, and if you're basing your entire build around an enchant, you're low-key, not even low-key, you're high-key a freak. As a whole, Deepwoken just needs to rework a lot of the enchants because a majority of them just aren't good or are left redundant due to better alternatives existing. Real quick, I want to talk about the absolute worst enchants in the game and potential fixes for them, starting with Gluttony. This enchant is redundant garbage and just needs a complete rework because as it is, it's useless. This thing just doesn't belong in the game anymore, and there's a talent that makes it redundant that basically everybody runs. Next up is Curse of the Bloodthirsty, which is just terrible. It was only popular when Blood Run first came out because people would use it for Bloodthirsty dagger builds and focus on your blood bar instead of your health bar. And since you can't sustain your blood bar and it doesn't naturally regenerate, it was just really good, right? But then they nerfed daggers blood scaling with the Curse of Bloodthirsty, and it left this enchant kinda useless. Along with that, it only does 3% more damage than Deferred, but then you get punished for missing M1s with 2% total health loss per miss. Honestly, just buff the damage on this thing because 10% isn't enough for its gimmick being unusable now, and the downside, making you have to play much more carefully. Honestly, I think a 15% damage buff for Curse of the Bloodthirsty would be fair. Maybe a little bit less, but I don't think 10% is alright. And then there's the Curse of Repulsion, should have just never been added to the game. Whoever thought of this was just padding patch notes because this thing doesn't have its place in anything except for cheese builds because people will go rifle and spam it to try and keep themselves back while outranging you. And then there's Bluster. This is just worse detonation, except it can be parried and blocked, which is just a weird like addition. This is another enchant that probably just shouldn't have been made, honestly. I hope the devs address these issues and buff the enchants that need it rather than nerfing the current more popular enchants. However, because honestly a majority of the enchants right now are just too weak, right? Like the ones that are fine are good and don't need to be nerfed because they kind of outclass the other ones because they're too weak, not because the ones that are used are too strong. As a whole, I just think that like if they were to buff anything, just specifically one enchant, that, if I had to choose, that would absolutely need a buff, just please, just buff Gluttony. Just buff Gluttony. It is the worst thing ever. Don't even buff it. Rework it, because it should not be the same thing as the Carnivore talent. It's ass. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Shout out to YouTube members Green, Brick, Pickle, High Card, Goobka, Philip, Flying Noodle 559, Simply Mo, Elstern, Fun Guns, Carlia, V. Corey, Axelor, and Drizzy Drake Fan. I actually still don't know what I'm gonna do for this month's song cover, so if you have any idea of like video game music you like or some shit, I don't know, with words, then send it down. I prefer female vocals. Anyway, I hope you all have an amazing day. Subscribe at any tier if you want to hear my song covers, which I'm back to releasing monthly, so if you want to buy a YouTube membership, go ahead, and goodbye.